The African king played very, very, very little role in politics. As a matter of fact, the king's function was not to rule his people. Now let me explain to you the role of the African king. In the African philosophy, in the African philosophical conception of the universe, there were three elements. There was the cosmos, and there was the world, and then there was the earth. Now, Africans believe that these three elements must always be in perfect harmony. In other words, the universe was like one giant equation, which must always be in perfect balance. If it is not in balance, something terrible will happen. In order to keep these three forces in balance, you see, the Africans sort of deified each one of these elements. Like the universe was a god. The world was a god. The earth was also a god. Now, it is important to remember that the king's role, the African king's role, was to maintain balance between these three elements. And one way of maintaining balance between these three elements is to make sure that these three gods were always procreated or kept happy. You have to make sacrifices to these gods in order not to make them angry. If the earth god was angry, then there would be poor harvests. Women will not have children, and so forth. Now, in order to be able to intercede in the universe, and among these various three forces, the king has to have some vital powers. The king has to have some supernatural powers, powers which nobody in the kingdom could have. So in other words, you see, the king's role was supernatural or divine. And that was what his main function was, to make sure that these three elements were always in order. He had very, very little role in politics. And as a matter of fact, in various tribes, you could not even see the king eat, because this king was supposed to be supernatural. The reason why I wanted to point this out to you is because, see, if the king had this particular role to play in the universe to maintain vital forces, then the king had very little. He delegated much of his authority to his subordinates. The king really didn't rule his people. His subordinates did. In that scheme of things, you see, you cannot think of the king being autocratic or the king taking all decisions, political decisions, because this was not the case. The king's role was to maintain balance between the three forces. But let me get down to the village level, because this is where the peasants were. At the village level, you had two types of governments. There were certain African tribes which did not have any centralized authority, and they were called stateless societies. Now, among the stateless societies were such tribes as the Igbo of Nigeria, the Gikuyu of Kenya, for example. Now, you might want to ask, why didn't these tribes have chiefs or centralized authority? It was because the Igbos or the Gikuyu felt that government was necessarily tyrannous or tyrannical, so they didn't want to have anything to do with centralized authority. In other words, tyranny was one thing that the African people were always aware of and were always very much afraid of. That's one of the reasons why the Igbo elected not to have any centralized authority at all. And then you have other tribes like the Zulu, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, which had centralized authority. The village government basically consisted of two institutions. The first one being the Council of Elders. In a minute, I'll describe how the Council of Elders was composed. And then you have the village assembly. And then in the tribes that had centralized authority, you have the third unit, which would be the chief. In other words, in the tribes that were settled, in contrast to pastoral tribes, almost every one of these tribes had a council of elders. You look at the Zulus, you look at the Chwanas, every one of them had a council of elders. You go to West Africa, they had a council of elders. Now, those tribes that had centralized authority had chiefs. Those that in the stateless societies, those that did not have centralized authority had council of elders and village meetings. Let's suppose that let's take a hypothetical village where you have, say, 10 extended families. Now, each extended family will choose their leader or their head, called family heads. When these 10 heads come together, they form a council of elders. In the states that have centralized authority, a council of elders will choose a chief. When the chief is chosen, the chief himself will find or will come together, would collect a few individuals, trusted individuals. And these individuals will become what is known as the chief's inner council of advisors. When there was an issue to be debated, the chief would try this issue by his advisors. They would debate this issue. And if they agree on this particular issue, they will present the issue to the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders would deliberate and debate this issue until they reach unanimity. The African political tradition is noted for the chief and his councils. Usually they will sit under a big tree and talk and debate, sometimes for days, until they reach unanimity. Unanimity has always been the cardinal feature of the indigenous political system. If the chief and his council of elders could not reach unanimous decision, then they are required by custom to call a village meeting. At the village meeting, the issue will be placed before the people. Quite often at the village meeting, the chief would not even speak. The chief will remain silent. And when the issue is placed before the people, any adult has the right to air their opinion freely. They would debate the issue back and forth. Now, at the village meeting, the emphasis was on consensus. You see, you cannot have unanimous decision at the village meeting because, you see, the chief and his council members could not reach unanimous verdict at the council meeting. So the village meeting had been called to determine a consensus. And really, a consensus is trying to determine a majority decision. In the African traditional system, once a consensus has been reached, then everybody is supposed to abide by it. In other words, once the decision has been made, everybody is required to respect that decision. Anybody who opposed that decision was seen to be against the tribe because the decision was not something which was imposed upon the tribe. It was the tribe, the whole tribe, which debated the issue and decided for themselves. So everyone else is expected to support the decision. It's important to understand it this way because when a lot of people came upon this tribal system, they said, there was no organized opposition. So you have a dictatorship. That's not true. There's a lot of misconception about the indigenous political system. See, a lot of people think that Shaka the Zulu was the typical of all African chiefs. Wrong.